It was just past 11 p.m. when everything changed in a small New York City apartment. The sound of a door being kicked in shattered the quiet. What happened next was fast, loud, and terrifying. Neighbors heard shouting, banging, and things crashing to the floor, followed by an eerie silence. Inside that apartment, a young woman was trapped in a moment she had long feared. Someone she once loved had returned, and this time he wasn't going to walk away quietly. This is the story of a night that began like any other, but ended in tragedy. In 2015, Alayna Hardy arrived in New York City, full of ambition and promise. At 27, she was pursuing her dream of becoming a physician's assistant. Her magnetic personality made her instantly likable, drawing people in wherever she went. With a bright future ahead, Alayna immersed herself in her studies and embraced the vibrant rhythm of the city. However, that hopeful journey took a dark turn when she met Fernando Munera. What began as a whirlwind romance quickly evolved into something far more dangerous. Their relationship, intense and passionate at first, soon spiraled into a toxic cycle of control, jealousy, and emotional turbulence. Friends and neighbors often saw them walking their dog or riding his motorcycle, appearing close and inseparable. But behind those smiles lay a relationship strained by volatility. As months passed, Mona's behavior grew increasingly erratic and aggressive. By early 2021, less than a year into their relationship, things had turned violent. In a chilling incident, he restrained Alayna in her own apartment, damaged her belongings, and seized her phone to prevent her from calling for help. This incident led to his arrest, with charges of harassment, unlawful imprisonment, and criminal mischief. A restraining order was issued, forbidding him from contacting Alayna, but it didn't stop him. What followed was a relentless pattern of harassment. Mona bombarded Alayna with calls, dozens over a single weekend. He criticized her appearance and tried to control how she dressed, even while she was traveling. His obsession deepened and his grip tightened. He couldn't bear the thought of her living independently outside of his control. Neighbors grew uneasy, noticing his erratic presence, muttering to himself and pacing furiously in front of the building. On May 19, 2021, the tension exploded. That evening, Mona was seen outside, consumed by anger, fists clenched, pacing with rage. He had argued with Alayna earlier that day, and she had refused to let him into her apartment. He vanished for several hours, and many assumed the chaos had subsided. But Mona was preparing for something unthinkable. Sometime that night, he returned armed with a knife and an air pistol. Under the cover of darkness, he waited near Alayna's apartment. Around 11 p.m., the horror unfolded. He forced his way into Alayna's apartment, smashing through the front door with violent determination. Inside, Alayna barely had time to react. Startled by the crash, she found herself face to face with her ex. Before she could think, move, or scream, there was nowhere to run and nothing to stop him. Within seconds, the small apartment became a battleground. Mona, armed with a knife and consumed by rage, unleashed the full force of his obsession. He stabbed Alayna 18 times, each blow calculated, brutal, and unrelenting. The apartment echoed with the sounds of struggle, Alayna's desperate cries, and the chaos that followed. The room was torn apart. Furniture lay overturned, blood streaked the walls, and the floor was slick with it. She cried out for help, but no one came. Neighbors heard everything, the thuds, the screaming, the crashing, but fear kept them frozen behind their closed doors. They listened as the violence continued, unaware of the full horror taking place just feet away. Mona didn't stop. He used the air pistol, not as a weapon of death, but as a tool of fear, waving it and aiming it, showing Alayna that even in her final moments, he was in control. His goal was not just to hurt her, it was to dominate her completely. She had tried to escape him, to set boundaries, to reclaim her life. That night, he took it back by force. When the attack finally ended, the apartment went still. Alayna lay motionless, her body bearing the savage marks of the man who refused to let her go. Mona stood above her, breathing heavily, blood still wet on his hands. There was no panic in him, no remorse, just the aftermath of a storm he had long planned. Then, without saying a word, he disappeared into the night. By the time police arrived, the damage was done. The apartment was a crime scene, soaked in silence and horror. The young woman who had once lit up rooms with her energy and smile was gone. Her life had been reduced to blood on the floor and a still body in the dark. Officers found no signs of Mona. He had vanished into the night like a ghost, leaving destruction in his wake. The manhunt began immediately. Police canvassed the area, questioned witnesses, and tracked his movements. Surveillance footage from local stores and subway platforms began to fill in the gaps. One clip showed him walking briskly, still in the same blood-stained clothes, eerily calm and focused, as if the murder hadn't shaken him at all. Investigators delved into his past, uncovering a deeply disturbing pattern of control, explosive tempers, and prior incidents of harassment and assault. Court records confirmed that Mona had always been volatile. Alayna's death wasn't his first act of violence. It was the final one in a long line of red flags. The restraining order, a last resort, had failed her completely. Alayna's family was shattered. Her mother couldn't believe that her daughter, the vibrant, funny, kind-hearted woman who had tried so hard to escape, was gone. The grief was heavy, made worse by the knowledge that Alayna had done everything she could. She had asked for help, set boundaries, and taken legal steps, but nothing had been enough. As news of the murder spread, New Yorkers took to the streets. Women marched in Alayna's name, vigils were held, and her story sparked a fire that resonated with thousands of women who had lived under the shadow of abuse. Alayna's death became a symbol, a tragic reminder of how the system fails those most in need of protection. For weeks, Mona remained missing. Then came the tip, a motel outside the city where a man had registered under a false name. Police moved in and found him inside a small room, unshaven, paranoid, and hiding from the world. The arrest was quick. There was no fight left in him, just silence and the weight of what he had done. As officers placed him in handcuffs and walked him out, there were no answers, only the echo of a question that haunted everyone who followed Alayna's story. What twisted logic leads a man to murder the woman he claimed to love? There was no explanation, just a quiet ride in the back of a squad car and a life that could never be restored. At the precinct, Fernando Munera said nothing. He stared ahead, uncooperative, offering no explanation or remorse. His silence didn't offer mystery, it confirmed it. Detectives had no confession to work with, only a chilling puzzle of obsessive behavior, digital breadcrumbs, and shattered lives. As the investigation deepened, a disturbing portrait came into focus. Mona hadn't seen Alayna as a partner. He saw her as property, something to possess. When she pulled away, when she stood her ground, he interpreted it as betrayal. In the months leading up to the trial, the evidence piled up. Witnesses described Mona's erratic behavior in the days before the murder, pacing, muttering, fixated on Alayna's apartment. Surveillance footage mapped his movements with eerie precision, tracking him from the streets to the door he eventually broke through. Forensic evidence told the rest of the story: fingerprints, DNA, and the marks left on Alayna's body. There were no other suspects, no ambiguity. The case wasn't about who had committed the crime, but whether the system would deliver justice. The courtroom was packed on the first day of Mona's trial. Every seat was filled, and the air was thick with tension, grief, fury, and the desperate hope that this time something would be made right. Alayna's family sat at the front, eyes locked on the man who had taken her from them. The prosecution opened with a grim timeline, detailing a man spiraling into possessive rage. They presented Mona as methodical, not impulsive. This wasn't a moment of madness. This was premeditation. They showed footage of Mona loitering outside Alayna's building, his posture tense, his face tight with anger. They recounted how he had left only to return with a knife and an air pistol. 2 weapons, not 1. 2 decisions, not 1. There was no hesitation, only escalation. Then came the photographs, images taken at the crime scene that silenced the room. Blood-soaked walls, torn furniture, a life brutally extinguished. A forensic pathologist walked the jury through the wounds. 18 stab wounds concentrated on the upper body, not random, not frenzied, but controlled, targeted, intentional. Each wound was described in clinical terms, but no language could soften the horror of what had been done. A neighbor described the noises on the night of the murder, the crashing, the faint screams, then nothing. Another recalled Mona outside earlier that evening, pacing like a man on the edge, fists clenched, muttering to himself, his eyes full of something unspoken but dangerous. Then the defense stood up. Their story was different. They didn't deny the attack, they didn't deny the death. Instead, they painted Mona as a man unraveling, pushed too far too fast by a relationship he couldn't process. They argued that he had snapped after being locked out, that it wasn't planned, but rather an emotional collapse. They cited a history of mental health struggles, suggesting his actions were the result of an undiagnosed condition. They called a psychologist to the stand who spoke of trauma, instability, and psychological deterioration. But the prosecution didn't flinch. They fired back with clarity and conviction. Mona didn't snap. He planned. He paced, returned, and armed himself. He broke down a door, used 2 weapons, and stabbed a defenseless woman 18 times. Then he disappeared. This was not the act of a man in emotional freefall. This was cold, calculated violence. There was no breakdown, no temporary lapse, only control, hatred, and the fatal outcome of unchecked obsession. Mona had made his decision long before that night, and Alayna Hardy had paid the price for it with her life. As the trial progressed, the courtroom became a charged space where 2 clashing versions of Fernando Munera stood side by side. The defense fought to present a broken man, remorseful, overwhelmed, and pushed beyond his limits. But the prosecution offered a far more terrifying reality: that Alayna Hardy, in her final moments, endured terror, helplessness, and pain at the hands of a man who saw her independence as defiance and her existence as something to control or destroy. Alayna's family never missed a day in court. Her mother sat with a framed photo of her daughter clutched to her chest, the kind of photograph that once captured a life full of light and hope. Tears flowed freely every time the prosecution revisited the brutality of the crime. But beyond the grief, there was resolve. Alayna's mother vowed that Mona would not walk away from what he had done. In closing arguments, the prosecution gave voice to that promise. They asked the jury to look at Mona not as a tragic figure, but as a deliberate predator. This wasn't a tragic mistake. It was cold, unrelenting violence. Alayna was not his partner. She had become his target the moment she fought to reclaim her life. The defense made one last effort to salvage Mona's image. They pleaded for understanding, repeating that he had acted in a moment of emotional collapse. They pointed to his remorse, his troubled past, and letters from friends describing a kind and caring man. But those words couldn't erase the evidence, the images, the witness accounts, the 18 stab wounds, or the months of escalating harassment. The jury deliberated for hours, each face drawn and heavy as they filed back into the courtroom. When the verdict was announced, guilty of second-degree murder, the air shifted. Relief, heartbreak, and the weight of finality filled the room. Alayna's family held each other tightly. It wasn't closure, nothing could bring her back, but it was a step toward justice. A month later, the courtroom was filled again, this time for sentencing. Alayna's mother rose to give her victim impact statement. Her hands shook, but her voice carried the heartbreak of a life forever altered. She spoke about the emptiness left behind, about the silence in her home where Alayna's laughter once lived. "She was my everything," she said, "and now she's gone. Not because of an accident, but because someone made a choice." The prosecution laid out the case again, this time focusing on consequences. They argued for the maximum sentence, emphasizing the calculated nature of the crime, how Mona had ignored the restraining order, how the violence had built steadily, and how the law must not take lightly the loss of a young woman's life. The defense responded with what little they had left, trying to appeal to compassion. Then Mona spoke. He stood slowly, pale and visibly shaken, facing Elena's family. He mumbled an apology, quiet, strained, almost inaudible. "I'm sorry," he said. "I never meant for this to happen." But the room stayed silent. For those who had lived through the trauma of Alayna's loss, words couldn't fix what he had shattered. The pain was too deep, the apology far too late. The judge delivered the sentence with solemn clarity. Mona was sentenced to 40 years to life in prison. The courtroom remained quiet as the verdict sank in. Alayna's family clung to one another, tears falling freely. It was not victory, it was not healing, but it was justice, something to hold on to in the face of immeasurable loss. As Mona was led away in handcuffs, his fate sealed, the courtroom began to empty. But Alayna's legacy was just beginning to grow. Her murder sparked something bigger, a renewed call to action. Her family, refusing to let her death be the end of her story, became advocates against domestic violence. They partnered with local organizations, launched awareness campaigns, and hosted events to educate others about the signs of abuse and the danger of ignoring red flags. The restraining order Alayna had taken out, ignored, violated, and ultimately useless, became a symbol of how the system had failed her. Activists used her story as a rallying cry, urging lawmakers to strengthen protections for victims and enforce them with real consequences. Alayna's friends often spoke about the woman she was. They remembered her laughter, her determination, and her dreams of becoming a physician's assistant. She was kind, ambitious, and full of life. They made sure that when people spoke her name, they didn't only remember how she died, but who she truly was. In the end, Alayna Hardy's story became more than a headline. It became a movement, a reminder, a warning, and a reason to fight harder for those who are still living in fear. Thank you for tuning in. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations.